directly.
Check 1, 2.
There you go.
It's such a large room with such a large crowd, we need a microphone. The tip of the ear. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Coastal Resources Division. Thank you for being here. This is a public hearing for the Coastal Marshlands Protection Act, or the rules for upland component. If you're here for something else, it's a different turnstile somewhere else. But I'm guessing everybody's here for that topic. My name is Doug Hammonds. I'm the Director of Coastal Resources Division. Jill Andrews, Chief of Coastal Management Section, will be providing the presentation for this evening. Josh Noble will introduce staff around the room. Josh Noble, somewhere, Beth Burns, Maitland Bass. I'm sorry guys, this is under the gun and I'm gonna forget as we go. All of permitting, and Megan Angelina, Clayton, Buck, in the compliance section, Tyler Jones, PIO. Did I miss anybody from CRE here? Mostly compliance and permitting. If you have questions afterwards about some other topics, those folks would be happy to spend some time with you if you got other topics besides what we have today. Quick notes, please silence your cell phone. If you need a restroom, there's one back here in the corner. Please make sure the door is shut. We're going to have a short 15-minute presentation followed by an opportunity for questions and answers about the presentation. Our goal here is to make sure that you understand what it is that we have proposed since this past September. To make sure that all the questions are done. After Q&A, then we will ask folks to step up to the microphone for a public comment period. If you prefer, you have a hard paper copy of a comment card, you're welcome to write your comment instead of getting it in public. Either way is fine with us. We're going to record the Q&A and the public comment period so that we can later transcribe that and have an accurate record of what was said tonight. Any questions before we get started on format? Again, thanks for being here, and I will turn it over to Jill.
Can you hear me? It's gonna sing to me, isn't it, Tyler?
Turn off the lights.
Okay. We need 3 hands to do all that. So, while we're hopefully sorting that out, and this will be our audio check, so please flag or wave me down if you cannot hear me. But again, I'm Jill Andrews. I'm Chief of the Coastal Management Section here at DNR Coastal Resources Division. And my responsibility is with Josh Noble together, we administer the regulatory program under the Coastal Marshlands Protection Act, of which this rule that we're talking about this evening is a part of. So just to be clear again, tonight we're talking about proposed amendment to regulation of an upland component of a project. That's Rule 391-2-3-.02. Again, it's under the CMPA. So I'm going to go through this presentation. I may talk a little fast. If you need clarification, please let me know, but we do plan to have questions and opportunity, as Doug said, at the end. If we need to stop in the middle, that's fine, but Doug did say that I would talk for 15 minutes, so I'm a little nervous now.
Okay.
It's planning for 47, so let's see how we do. Already my mouse is kaput.
Use your arrow keys.
Let's see, arrow keys. Okay, I want to go starting with some background information on what this is, what we're regulating with upland components. So the rule was developed back in 2007 via an extensive citizen stakeholder committee. We called it the Upland Stakeholder Committee, and it was actually an offshoot or a branch, if you will, from another stakeholder committee grappling with a different set of issues related to marinas and community docks. So that Marina Community Dock Committee was the core group for what we call the Upland Stakeholder Committee that was dealing with this very specific and tricky issue of how far upland does the purview of the Coastal Marshlands Protection Act extend. So the rule's purpose, let's see, wait, this isn't going to work without a mouse. Okay, I think it just is. When you lose your mouse, you hit buttons you shouldn't. Okay, we're back in business, but I don't think we're in the right slide.
Just can you use your arrows to back it up.
Yeah. All right. This is tricky. So the rules purpose, as adopted by the DNR board, was to apply primarily to commercial, community, and public projects, such as marinas, community docks, fishing piers, boat ramps, and bridges. The rules impose marshlands buffer, stormwater management, and impervious cover criteria and standards, which were only triggered when the CMPA permit is needed for activities located in the coastal marshlands. This is crazy. The upland component of the project is the part of the project, again, where the standards are only in effect in the upland component, so they don't exist in the CMPA or anywhere else. So the current definition of an upland component is a service area, amenity, or recreational area that augments the functioning of the CMPA permitted in marsh project. Or those facilities that exclusively serve the users of the CMPA permitted project. The definition goes so far as to list out very specific amenities associated with marinas and similar type structures. You can see those were dry stack storage, dock master shop, restroom, fuel storage, delivery facilities, but it also includes other facilities determined by the Coastal Marshlands Protection Committee as likely to alter coastal marshlands. Now that committee that referenced here is the actual permit issuing authority, so they would be able to determine if there's other facilities that needed to be part of the upland component. So since 2007, it's generally been pretty easy, consistent application of the rules. But I would say in more recent years, we've seen more projects in coastal marshlands that don't really fit the original mold. So we'll be talking about several of those tonight, but some of those are including like the local government projects that are for drainage, ditch maintenance, culverts, projects associated with non-DOT roads, as well as certain conservation projects that might be undertaken by the state or local government. And also in 2022, we had a change in how we manage and regulate shoreline stabilization projects, such that they now are more routinely triggering the upland component rules, where prior to 2022, they did not. So it's been a little bit of a challenge to determine if or even how the upland rules apply to some of these different project types. And specifically because of how the change in how we regulate shorelines, we felt that this was the right time to reevaluate the upland rule, revisit its original purpose, make sure we're staying aligned with that, and clear up any ambiguity or any lack of clarity in some of the terms used in the definition of the upland component. So before I go into the specifics of the proposed rule amendment, I do want to take a minute and make sure everyone has a clear understanding of how the upland rules are currently applied. So I'm going to give you a few examples that I hope are helpful. So the first one I'm going to point out is the Savannah Boathouse, which is a 2018 project that was permitted. And the project includes an in-water marina. It has an in-water marina. It also has an upland dry stack marina. Because it does have the in-water component, it did trigger the Coastal Marshlands Protection Act permit process. Because it has the dry stack storage marina and other related amenities, it did trigger the upland rule process as well. And I did want to point out that this is a single parcel that this project is located on. And once the CMPA permit was triggered and the rules were triggered, the activities on the upland were determined to be wholly or directly associated with the in-water marshlands component. And this project was unique because in fact the entire parcel itself, with all the activities going on there, was included as part of the upland component. And so all the standards within the upland rule were applied, including the 50-foot marshland buffer, stormwater and impervious cover criteria. So it's not often that you see the entire parcel being associated with upland component, so this is a good example of that. This slide shows a different example of a community dock that's associated with a new residential development. So this project was permitted in 2023. The dock required a CMPA permit, so it's down in here, and the upland rules were triggered because of the proposed parking and pervious walkway, access walkways that were in the upland leading to access the dock. The upland component the upland component of this project consisted of only one community parcel. So it's only this parcel highlighted in yellow. That's the parcel where the upland amenities were located. If this is humming again, Tyler. The CMPA and the upland rules have no purview over any other part of the proposed residential development that's going to be using this dock. So again, I want to point out that the upland component is only limited to this area in yellow. And then lastly, I wanted to highlight a project, the most complex upland component that I've ever worked on. I think we've ever worked on. It's known as the wharf. Again, we permitted this, I think, in 2018. This project triggered a CMPA permit because of two floating dock systems. They also proposed the excavation of some marsh to create a new basin marina that will be dug out of the uplands. So on this one, what's unique is the upland component was 31 acres and consisted not only of your typical marina amenities such as a marina store, parking, those types of things, but also included a disposal site for the dredge material that would be taken out for the basin marina. And this area, which was quite a ways from the marsh and only indirectly connected, was included in the upland component again because of its exclusive use to augment the function or serve the purpose of the in-water marshland component. So again, a very complicated upland component. You can see the entire boundary is this entire area in orange. So I also wanted to point out the wharf because it has a couple other features that I think are really important to this discussion. You see the area that I just highlighted in orange at the bottom of your screen. That is, again, the southern boundary of the upland component. And you can see down here that there are some proposed structures that are south of the upland component boundary. This was proposed commercial, retail, those type of amenities, if you will, those types of activities, associated parking. They were not included in the upland component because these particular parts of the proposal can exist without the marina, don't specifically augment the functioning of the marina. If the marina doesn't get built, these can still be built and function properly. The marina can also function if these are never built as well. So these are not part of the upland component. So I wanted to point that out as well. And then more on the wharf. It's also a really excellent example, and maybe a clearer example than some I've given before, of how this Coastal Marshlands Protection Act Upland Rule Marsh Buffer, which is a 50-foot marsh buffer, which is part of the rule, and the State Erosion and Sedimentation, or an E&S buffer, which is regulated by the Environmental Protection Division and/or local issuing authorities, intersect on the same project. So in green, you'll see that within the orange boundary that is the upland component, there is delineated on this project map an upland component of a 50-foot marsh buffer within the upland component. So that's the green right here. But now we're outside of the upland component. We're south of this orange boundary line. And here you'll see that what's being applied here is a 25-foot E&S buffer. So same project, location, the application of two different buffers based on the fact that this area is the upland component to a CMPA permitted project. So I know there's been some questions about how these two buffers, how they're different or how they interplay. And what I'll use this example for as well is if the CMPA or the permit committee did not issue this permit, then this 50-foot buffer would not exist. Right, that 50-foot buffer is only there when this project is permitted with that upland component. Okay, so that's really important to what we're discussing here, I think. I've been reading the newspapers. I follow a little bit of social media, and I know that the buffer question, as well as bank stabilization, has been the cause for some concern for this proposed amendment. So I do want to take an extra minute to make sure that we talk about how shoreline stabilization is regulated currently. And it is a big part of why we are proposing to update this rule. So I'm going to follow my notes because I want to get this right, y'all. So first, prior to August 2022, only very few shoreline stabilization projects actually trigger the requirement for a CMPA permit. So those would have been our larger shoreline stabilization projects greater than 500 feet, or ones that were more wholly in the marsh and required fill in the marsh. So very few bank stabilization projects at all. CRD did in fact authorize all bank stabilization projects. So while very few went through the CMPA, all bank stabilization projects have been authorized by CRD through a different mechanism, so not through the CMPA. And for many reasons, in August of 2022, we revised our practice of how we authorize bank stabilization projects. And when I say bank stabilization, I mean shoreline projects, bulkheads, living shorelines, riprap, and the like. So we revised our practice of how we authorize these types of projects in order to require that all shoreline stabilization projects get a full CMPA permit. So there is currently more regulatory oversight of bulkheads and living shorelines now than prior to August 2022. Okay? So the timing is important because when the upland rules were adopted, shoreline projects were not a part of the CMPA regulatory program. Therefore, the rules did not, or really couldn't, consider how the buffer, stormwater, and impervious cover standards would apply to shoreline stabilization projects, primarily since a lot of these projects exist on residential properties, right? So they're not commercial public projects. Most bank stabilizations are on private residential properties. So as a result, we find that the definition of upland component in particular does not really clearly apply to bank stabilization projects. So for instance, the upland component of a bulkhead is typically going to consist of a tieback system that's buried underground and recovered with vegetation. And similarly, with our living shorelines, that upland component is going to consist of vegetative plantings that helps control stormwater from eroding the shoreline. And so when we find that we are looking at a 50-foot buffer on a bank stabilization project, what's typically occurring for the most part in that area is the construction activities. So the temporary impacts to construct that shoreline stabilization project. So to give you a little bit of an example, we don't have many examples prior or since 2022, but here's one that we can take a look at. So this project proposed a bulkhead, and they proposed to place it generally on or just seaward of what we call the CMPA jurisdiction line. So it's the physical line in the field that defines where the coastal marshlands end and the upland begins. So we call that the JD line. So they proposed to put the bulkhead pretty much right on that line. Of course, it's not, a sliver thin bulkhead, and so there are both impacts in the marsh and there are also impacts in the upland. So the thick black line is the actual proposed bulkhead, and right behind it is a gray line that's really hard to see, and that is the upland component of this project, and that is for a tieback system. So they recommended put in some pilings as well as the tieback anchors. So that's the project. And if we measure 50 feet of the upland buffer from the marsh JD line, from the coastal marshlands line, 50 feet back, you can see this is where the 50-foot buffer occurs on that property. I tried to delineate in a very squiggly lighter gray line here. That is the outline of the actual residential structure. And the buffer also goes through an existing pool deck and encompasses nearly all of their backyard. So let's get to what we're actually proposing. The proposed amendment is to add language to the definition of upland component, which is only found in the upland rule itself, right? So it's not a definition that occurs in the CMPA or anywhere else. And so we want to add the language such that it's clear that it only applies to what we consider to be the original project types, as when the rule was publicly vetted and adopted by the DNR board. So the proposed amendment is that the new definition of upland component of a project will add the language associated with marinas, community docks, commercial docks, fishing piers, boat ramps, and bridges. So that's the official addition. What I think it will wind up saying is that an upland component of a project is all those service areas, amenities, and recreational areas associated with marinas, community docks, commercial docks, fishing piers, boat ramps, and bridges. Okay? So, and aside from one other minor correction of a typo, under marshland's buffer, there are no other changes proposed. So, in our view, that's a limited amendment. This amendment is not intended to roll back any marsh protections. It will not change a thing within the actual Coastal Marshlands Protection Act itself. It is not intended, nor will it fast-track bulkheads or shoreline hardening. I think those are important points to make. So what it will do, if this amendment is passed, is DNR will continue to regulate all activities that impact coastal marshes. We will continue to regulate marsh impacts to wetlands and living shorelines and riprap and other shoreline stabilization projects. We will regulate upland service areas, amenities, and recreational areas, including 50-foot marsh buffers associated with marinas, community docks, commercial docks, fishing piers, boat ramps, and bridges. And we will continue to regulate projects in the marshlands for local governments or state governments that are not otherwise exempt from the CMPA, including drainage, road, and some conservation projects. The rule change will not eliminate any other local government or state environmental protection division buffer regulations along coastal marshlands. So this has no effect on local ordinances or the regulation of erosion and sedimentation buffers or any other buffer regulations that may exist out there. This is only those buffers within that very limited scope of projects in the upland rule. And so again, to reiterate, this change will not, if this change goes through, we will not regulate upland components on projects that are not marinas, community and commercial docks, fishing piers, boat ramps, and bridges. And then lastly, I wanted to mention that, again, sort of responding to some public concern that we've heard already, the marsh buffers for shoreline stabilization projects are regulated. They will continue to be regulated in the same manner as they were prior to 2022. I could go down into a lot of information on that and how we have done that, but suffice it to say that before coast bank stabilization projects came before the CMPA, we had a system in place to coordinate the buffer requirements of those projects with the Environmental Protection Division. It involved an 8-point checklist and direct coordination with EPD, with carbon copies to local issuing authorities, and what we were looking for was a determination of whether or not a buffer variance would be required or not. This is an erosion and sedimentation buffer variance, and whether it would be required or not on those projects. So that coordination will resume and be a part of shoreline stabilizations in particular moving forward. Of course, here I'm at the end, and I realized I forgot something, y'all. So when I was talking about upland component again with the buffers, okay, if I go back, I don't want to, make this unclear, but when we are again talking about the marshlands buffer, that 50-foot buffer, there are 3 things that are already allowed to occur in that buffer and can be permitted under the CMPA, right? So those are going to be the construction and maintenance of temporary structures, the things that you need to build your marsh component. So a lot of those marsh components are built from the land, if they can't be built from the water. And you can also construct or maintain permanent structures that are going to help with the functionality of the marshlands component, primarily access to that function, the marshlands component, right? You have to have a way to get there, and it might be a walkway or sometimes it's a road, depending on what type of facility you're constructing. And then finally, planting and grading, and then passive access for recreation. But why I really wanted to come back to this slide was because there's also buffer hardships that can be granted by the Coastal Marshlands Protection Committee, which I have to look up, right? So we don't have many of these, but if an applicant does come forward and request a buffer hardship, they have to convince the committee, this is again the permit issuing committee, that they cannot practically use the land for its intended purpose as a result of the buffer, because of the size or configuration of their property, or existing restrictions on their property, which could be in the form of deed restrictions or local building ordinances. And also, they have to guarantee that the situation is not created by their own selves after March 2007. So most of Georgia's buffer regulations that I'm aware of have some sort of exemption or hardship, and so this is not any different. Okay, so now that I went out of order, back to where we are today. So the public participation plan is a requirement of the board rulemaking process. So as Doug mentioned earlier, we did start this in August and September of 2023. Fast forward, here we are today with a public hearing with our second version, an amended version of the rule. And I wanted to point out in particular that we are accepting public comment through January 19th, 2024. And on this slide, you can see where you can send those comments to. I'll accept them via email, or if you want to go through snail mail, here's our address. If you want to double down and send them both ways, that's fine. I do not mind. We have seen that folks have been submitting them to the Board of Natural Resources. That is not your best path forward, because I can't guarantee that I'm gonna get everything that they get, because I'm the one receiving them. So please do make sure, you know, wherever else you send it, make sure that I'm at least on the CC list, okay? Okay. And I think we're probably gonna have a number of questions.
Raise your hand if you're gonna have a question this evening about the presentation. 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. Let's start here, Joe, work our way back in the room.
Yep, and I think we might need you to use the microphone.
I'll pass one. Go ahead, and we'll start with Alice and work our way back in the room.
Thank you, Jill, for the presentation. At the last, my name is Alice Keyes, and I'm with the organization 100 Miles. At the last public hearing, there was a discussion about revocable licenses that CRD has issued for the shoreline stabilization projects. I'll ask that y'all explain how that works and explain the size of the projects that are covered under like a revocable license. And I ask particularly related to the condition of a 500 linear foot bank stabilization project, like a bulkhead, being covered under kind of general permitting for the Army Corps of Engineers, and whether CRD has additional conditions for projects smaller than 500 linear feet to ensure that the marsh is protected.
Okay, sure, Alice, I'll be happy to do that. I do want to sort of point out that the question is really relating to impacts in the marsh and not as much to the upland component. So where they intersect, I'll try to call that out. But what you asked for is revocable licenses. So the Department of Natural Resources is the trustee for the coastal marshlands, and it's a delegated authority from the governor. Since these are state properties, if an individual, corporation, business, property owner wants to, let's say, occupy or use part of that public resource, they need permission to do that. And so for coastal marshlands and estuarine areas of the state, Coastal Resources Division is the delegated authority, and so the tool that we have is a revocable license. We can grant that to the individual or person, and that license is accompanied by a description of what that permission is for. So, I guess they did good on that. Okay, so any project that is occupying state property in the coastal area is going to receive a revocable license in addition to any other required permits. So every CMPA permit that I can think of also has a revocable license. Some of our shore protection permits do if they're below ordinary high water in state property. So, okay, so the RL is that permission to use that space. So before I ever came to CRD, and up until 2022, the revocable license was the tool to regulate shoreline stabilization projects. And so I can't tell you how it came about. It was a practice, like I said, it's a long-standing practice that was over 20 years. And what had happened at some point was that CRD and the Army Corps of Engineers agreed, I guess, on standards and criteria for shoreline stabilization projects. And if they were under 500 linear feet, or they constituted less than 1 cubic yard of fill per running foot, then they were considered projects that could be authorized under a revocable license by CRD. So projects that were greater than 500 linear feet, or that had more fill, those were the projects I mentioned earlier that would wind up under coastal marshes catch-up permit. So those types of projects have been permitted along. So it's just those few little smaller ones, right? We changed that practice in 2022. That's the practice that was changed. So your stabilization projects are still going to get their revocable license, but they're also going to receive a CMPA permit. If there are activities in the upland associated with that, they'll also be subject to the upland rule. There's no nexus. So,
Even projects less than 500 linear feet,
Yes.
is
Well,
stabilization projects
Yes.
less than 500.
Yeah, so at this time, since 2022, every bank stabilization project will require a full coastal marshes protection act permit.
Maggie with Altamaha Riverkeeper, could you go back to the picture of the bulkhead of the residential property and explain in a little more detail how that would be handled today and how it would be handled if these changes
Okay.
are put into effect?
Sure, okay, so what I'm showing here is how it was handled today. This was permitted in 2023, so after the change. And so what you see is here is the bulkhead that was permitted. The permit included the upland component, which includes the tieback system, which is that gray line that we can see right there. And it calculated activities in the 50-foot marshlands buffer, which is delineated on the project site here. So prior to 2022, you would see a revocable license that was accompanied by this same drawing minus this magenta line. And there might be discussion, there would probably be discussion of that tieback system, because that would be required for EPD's coordination, in determining whether or not a marsh erosion and sedimentation buffer would be required, or a variance would be cut. The buffer's there, erosion and sedimentation buffer's there. They needed that information to know whether a variance would be required. Does that make sense? So that's the primary difference between then and now. So what we are proposing is, with the rule change, we will once again go back to a drawing that looks like this. It's gonna show the bulkhead, and it's not gonna be subject to the upland rules. So this 50-foot buffer line would again go away. I contend that that little gray shaded area behind there with the upland component, the former upland component, is still going to be required, because EPD is still going to have to determine if an erosion and sedimentation buffer variance is required. So that information will still need to be shown, but this project will not be subject to the upland rule.
And just one part, but that's true if there's no dock, or
Absolutely.
this says
Yeah.
existing dock, but dock or no dock.
Correct.
All of it's the same rule.
Dave Kyler, Center for Sustainable Coast. I thought it was confused before. I'm a little more confused now, but not necessarily because of your explanations. But, from what I understand, from what you said, there is a coordination between CRD, Coastal Resources Division, for those who don't know the acronyms, and EPD, Environmental Protection Division, on buffers that are covered under the Soil Erosion and Sedimentation Act. You said there was an 8-point aspect of that review by EPD.
I was trying to find my reading glasses so I could write down your comments, so I could answer the right question. So, and Josh, Maitland, feel free to jump in, but yes. So, many years ago now, a while ago now, we realized that coordination wasn't quite as tight as it should be. And so we started to work with EPD through a series of meetings. Some of those meetings involved our local issuing authorities, the LIAs. And this was primarily after EPD had a change on how they regulated and from where they regulated their erosion and sedimentation buffers on coastal marshlands. So that's a whole nother story that Dave and I can wax on about. But so that coordination began to get tightened up. We realized that these projects needed to be seen. And this is really very, very specific to bank stabilization projects. I do want to make that known for folks. And that's where most of the coordination needed to be tightened up. Because again, we were just issuing the revocable license at that time. So there was no public notice of these projects and so forth. So we tightened up that coordination over a couple of different years. And what came out of that was EPD saying, listen, if I know the answers to these 8 questions, I can tell this property owner and CRD if they're gonna require a buffer variance. So that ENS buffer is there. I can tell them these 8 questions if a buffer variance is required. So that's how that was generated, and that's how we've been applying this coordination 8-point checklist, if you will. That's more my term than anybody else's, but every applicant has to answer those questions.
And EPD staff administers that buffer?
Yes, only EPD can issue a buffer variance, I think. I'm looking at that in my LIAs. They can make the call, but they can't issue the variance. They can issue. I'm not gonna speak for EPD.
Right, but I think what's confusing to me, and justifiably confusing to the public, is why buffers are regulated differently by different parts of DNR and defined in such an awkwardly truncated way. It would make a lot more sense for everyone if they were buffers were regulated by one section of DNR, regardless of whatever components on the marsh side or the land side there were.
Sounds like a comment, Dave.
Yeah.
Any
Anyway,
questions?
Yeah, question. So, another question is there public information about this EPD interface with CRD on buffers that now EPD only regulates?
So the rules are available. EPD has a set of rules related to their buffers on coastal marshlands. And I think I mentioned before, but what that indicates is that that buffer is, if you will, drawn from a line that CRD marks in the field, right? So there is a little bit of a who's on what, where's on second, I don't know what that phrase is, but there is a little bit of co-management there anyway. And so that's just built into the process. We are DNR, I guess, right? We're one DNR, we can do it all together. So, then I got excited about that, and I forgot what your question is. So public information. So yes, I mean, so you can find the laws and rules are of course publicly available. The coordination, I mean, we can share that out to the public in some way, but where it really exists is in an application form, right? So the applicant comes in and they want a project, they're going to be confronted with this checklist, if you will, that they're going to have to respond to. And that checklist essentially is, again, those series of questions and information needed to determine if the rules and the laws related to buffer variances are triggered. So it's all circling back to the rules and the regulations.
Keep in mind too, Mr. Collar, that the 8 points that Jill were talking about from EPD was in response to compliance issues. Number one, CRD issued a revocable license for a bulkhead not knowing whether or not EPD was going to require a buffer variance. Mm-hmm. So what we were doing was coordinating prior to our license being issued to ensure that the applicant knew whether or not a variance was going to be required. Then either the project could then be modified, or they could then proceed simultaneously with both processes in order to try to be lock in step, if you will, with both authorizations, one not conflict another, or a contractor not to try to use, say I got a license from CRD, I didn't know I needed something from EPD. So it was really an effort to ensure that there was good coordination between both agencies, to your point. So that was the origin of that checklist.
That's all I had.
And keep in mind now, all bank stabilization projects regulated through the CMPA are going out on public notice, right? So, and then we also have an internal interagency review, interagency team email distribution list that goes to all the resource agencies. So any bank stabilization project goes to the Corps, EPD, any other LIAs, anyone that's been, that's signed up for our list.
Okay, go ahead.
Chairman, I'm Stacy Colbert with the Glynn County Engineering Services.
I don't think your mic is working.
I got a loud voice, so everybody can hear me. I got an easy question. Can we get a copy of the presentation?
Yes.
Okay.
Hey, Courtney Wright with Georgia Conservancy. I wanted to ask a question, or just pose like a scenario for this example that you have, just so I understand what's being permitted by you currently under the current regulation. So if this applicant had like a pool deck and a patio proposed in that 50-foot buffer, would that be something that you would regulate currently under the upland rules?
So that pool deck and patio probably would not be part of an upland component, but there's a bank stabilization. So,
Because it doesn't service the in-water fund or
Yeah,
the
so-
revocable license.
it would not be part of the upland component.
Okay.
This is sometimes why I say crayons are really helpful.
Hi, this is, I'm Bill Sapp with the Southern Environmental Law Center, and I thought your presentation was great, and I appreciate you taking the time to do that. But to this diagram you've got here, and this goes to upland components, but if you had a situation, whether it's a road or a pool deck, that could not be built unless a bulkhead was installed, would that road be considered an upland component of that bulkhead or not?
Josh and Allison.
So
are in the process
when
of
you
it.
say road, speaking of a private road,
Any
the
road?
reason I say that is because Department of Transportation activities are exempt from the Marsh Act. So therefore, that there would be no upland component if it were a DOT road.
And if it were not a DOT road?
If it were not a DOT road, then most likely what would happen is that applicant would then have to demonstrate the need and potentially go through the hardship provision of the upland rules. If it were proposed within the 50-foot buffer, and keep in mind, that would be dependent upon what the application for the project was for. Is it simply a road? And we've had that, a similar project, it was last year, it was Chatham County, Wall Tower Road. And there was, I do not believe the buffer was applied there. It was an existing road in that case. Maybe not the greatest example. So the applicant can drive that as well, right? Who is the applicant, what is the project?
So just to be clear, I guess I have a question that goes back in time a little bit, before August of 2022. Now you say, I think you said, Jill, that you could build a bulkhead in the marsh. So you'd have a structure in the marsh before August 2022 without getting a permit from the Coastal Marshland Committee.
Yes, right, if it was under that threshold that we talked about. Yes, it would not need a committee permit, it would have needed a revocable license with that specific letter that we attached to that license.
And
Okay.
most likely a nationwide permit from the court, right? Some form of a nationwide.
And why was that change made in August 2022? Was there, was the law changed? Why was that
No,
change made?
so like I said, this is something that, if you will, has been going on for 20 plus years. And so, just over time, we had the ability to evaluate and review this. We felt, that wasn't a specific, nothing dramatic happened at that time, but we just felt that sort of bringing it back under the fold of the CMPA and a conservative read of the CMPA, that would put us on, firmer legal footing when it came to bank stabilization projects. So, a long-standing practice, and I think we felt like it just needed to be tightened up.
Okay, and back to my road question. So we've got a private road, it's not gonna get built unless there's a bulkhead, supporting it, holding the bank in place. How would that be permitted differently before the amendment and, after the amendment?
So are you one of those guys that tells, one of those applicants that says everything that they're doing up front? Because there's a couple of different ways to spin that, and that's why I don't like on-the-fly scenarios because there's so many different points to consider, right? So they can come in for a bank stabilization project with no mention of the road, so long as they demonstrate that they have erosion, right? Or they can go and build the road with no mention of a bank stabilization project. Now, a bank stabilization project with a road, I don't know if I've seen one of those in a long time, but
I was trying to think of one.
Yeah, I can't say that I can off the top of my head be able to say whether or not that road is an upland component, because that road can exist without the, I know what you're saying, that, well, you know, it's not gonna be a good road, right? But in theory, the road could be narrower, it could be a little shifted this way or whatever, or it could be a sailing road, but there still could be a road, so, I mean, this, I don't know that this is really a dog I've walked.
No, if we're talking about a new road and you're gonna have to install shoreline stabilization in order to build a road, I'm questioning why you're building the road there, right? You know, staff, the first thing we're gonna do is try to understand the justification for the project as put forth by the applicant, and then subsequently be seeking why other alternative sites can't be used, right? In a road within 50 feet of the marsh that's gonna have a bulkhead for it to be there would be a challenge to get a positive staff recommendation, I would say. Whether prior to 22, August 22 or post, right? I
But
believe.
certainly prior to 2022, we would probably never have seen the road, right?
So I guess what I'm getting at is before the amendment, that road or pool deck or whatever that would be getting built in that 50-foot buffer would have to be considered, like right now. But after this amendment goes through, you wouldn't be looking at that 50-foot buffer at all. So essentially, there wouldn't be a 50-foot buffer under CRD.
Right. The only buffer that would be applied would be local or the erosion and sedimentation buffer.
Okay.
And/or.
Okay, that
There's
helps
still a
me.
buffer, just not the CNPA buffer.
Second question.
Are there any first questions? All right, let me see a show of hands for the number of people who intend to make public comment. Okay, we'll go for second questions, Dave.
Okay, this has something to do with, does DNR issue reports that summarize the permitting activity by location, yearly or something, a type of permit and location?
So we do report to, who does that go to, Doug? Report up to DNR, and I don't know where that report goes, but we do,
Trying to report?
well, we have multiple, right?
I
So
mean, a public report, public would normally say.
I don't know if the report is public or not.
So your triennial is public, but it goes to the legislature.
We also, we have performance measures, that's what I'm thinking of.
Yeah, performance measures, it's all public because it's all horrible, but that gets submitted to, OPD. Our performance measures, ultimately go to OPD. And who was,
I just have a clarification. I believe I heard you correctly in one of the answers you're giving, that you said there's a requirement to demonstrate erosion is occurring. Is that true for all bank stabilization applications, that they're required to demonstrate that erosion is occurring?
So CRD is not the permit issuing authority, but the Coastal Marshlands Protection Committee is. And so they have to determine whether or not a project is in the public interest. And so when a bank stabilization project comes before them, one of the things that we are looking to advise them on is why this project is justified. So we don't have a lot of experience in this. This is again a new transition time for us. But we believe that the committee at a minimum will be looking to know whether there is some reason why this shoreline stabilization project, be it a bulkhead or a living shoreline, is going in place rather than living a natural shoreline. So erosion is an easy thing to say. We've learned that some areas may be subject to subsidence, and that might be an acceptable justification as well. There may be other circumstances that we haven't encountered yet, so I won't say it's a requirement, but it's certainly an acceptable piece of information we would be looking for, and whether or not the committee needed it or not, I can't speak to.
Is that going to be true moving forward if it reverts back to only requiring a revocable license? That it'll still go before the committee to get the revocable license?
This isn't reverting back to just a revocable license.
You still,
No,
Here-
all
here
bank
for-
stabilizations will be regulated under the Coastal Marshes Protection Act, meaning every site will receive, or not, a CMP permit. We're not reverting back to the pre-August 22 standards.
The only thing,
Just removing the upland and the 50-foot buffer requirement.
so basically the difference is 25 feet.
Okay, that was an important clarification, thank you.
Glad that happened.
Okay, so we'll move into the public comment portion. And because I saw 4 hands, and I'm a big softy, I will typically go 3 minutes, I'll go 5 minutes if you guys will work with me on that. Because I know everybody, you know, their time is valuable. So, and remember that if you don't want to provide oral public comment, you can provide written comment either on the card that we gave you, or you can send it in. So who's first? Dave? Mike's yours. And this is all kind of fun, right?
So some of these comments have been somewhat modified, which I'm gonna try to handle on an ad hoc basis as I go through them. There's very little light over here. Can I go back where I was, get more light?
Here, I'll bring a microphone to you.
We can turn the lights off a little. Bentley, could you see if you can push the lights a little bit?
There's no light over the podium on this front. Okay, my general approach to this is to make more information available to the public rather than on a case-by-case, permit-by-permit basis, on a watershed or year-by-year basis to get an idea of the cumulative effects of multiple permitting activities. I thought I might be able to get into that by looking at the online CRD permitting database, but from what I could tell in my rather quick scrutiny of it, it was kind of very hard to initiate an inquiry, and what inquiries you were asking for were site-specific and time-specific for one permit. The point being that for an individual to find out, say in the last 2 years, how many permits have been issued for a given watershed or impact zone, it'd be extremely laborious to use that permitting database format to find out anything. So what I would highly recommend is there be a CRD public information, not legislative, but public information in publicly available language and with plenty of displays, including mapping, issued annually to explain where the permitting was done, what permit exemptions were made, what permits were rejected, what permit violations occurred, and anything else that applies, including letters of permission, which circumvent permitting altogether, where they were, and in a given period of time, what they consisted of by name, time, and location. That's my main point. But it also has been suggested that, and I don't know whether this even applies after what we discussed tonight about EPD's Environmental Protection Division's administration of the buffer under their authority. But there's some suggestion that there'd be local government activities, regulations that could supplement, I guess, either EPD's or CRD's functions as they affect the marsh. But while that is, not to be discouraged, on the other hand, it's no replacement for state authority, because there'd be so much variation in the rigor and standards that would apply from local government to local government, and that most local governments don't have the budget or the expertise of knowledge to know how a given activity would affect the wetlands, the marsh, and their vulnerable resources. So, in general, I just would suggest better public information as described.
Yep, thanks, Dave, appreciate that. Nothing's different being required of local governments today than it will be next year, right?
That's correct.
They do the same thing. So just to that point, and I'm not gonna try to counterpoint everything, but we're gonna be asking nothing different of a local issuing authority or local government than they currently do or did before 22 or into the future, right? Their role is the same. Next comment? Courtney? We'll try this or that?
I'll go here.
Okay.
And then calling on you. My name is Courtney Rank. I'm with Georgia Conservancy. And I wanted to thank you for the opportunity to speak tonight and for the opportunity to talk and work with the staff as we work through this issue. You know, my comments really are just, you know, acknowledging how complex this issue is. And we realize that the regulation and the changes that came in 2022 really impacted CRD's responsibilities. But it is that complexity, I think, that requires or would behoove us all to step back and take some more time, perhaps through a stakeholder committee, to really look at how the different agencies are currently regulating these areas, particularly related to these smaller residential bank stabilization type projects. Look at the different agencies, both local, state, federal, how it's being currently regulated, how it will be regulated in the future, where are there holes. I mean, EPD, that example there, I would argue EPD would exempt it because the impervious surface might be more than 18% of the total parcel, which would exempt them from the 25-foot buffer requirement. So I think I want to look at this just more as an opportunity because it is so confusing and so complex and involves so many different agencies to maybe come up with a process that makes more sense, is more efficient, is a better use of limited resources, but actually, you know, does a better job of achieving the goal of protecting the marsh. So I would encourage us and you at CRD to consider a stakeholder committee prior to adoption of this rule change. Thank you.
Jill, are you gonna comment?
Yeah, I'd love to. First, I think it's great that y'all have come here today because this is an important issue. What we're talking about is removing the 50-foot buffer from projects involving shore stabilization, like bulkheads. And the reason that's important, you know, why we have to keep our eye on bulkheads is because there are going to be more and more bulkheads built along the Georgia coast over the years as sea level rises.
Hey, Bill?
Yep.
I greatly appreciate your comments, but rather than speaking to the crowd, I mean, the comment's supposed to come CRD's way and specific to the point. So just asking if you'll speak to us.
Okay, sounds good. I will face that way. But you are all in my heart, and hopefully you'll be able to hear what I have to say.
I'm sure
So,
you've been at public meetings where the public sentiment has been built up based on speakers before, and we simply try to avoid that.
okay,
So,
I'll do my best. But my name is Bill Sapp, and I will do my best to face this way. But essentially, I'm an attorney with the Southern Environmental Law Center. I do a lot of work on the coast, been with SELC since 2007, and have been sort of watching this issue over the years. This all goes back to 2007, when the Coastal Resources Division was faced with a question. And that question was, do they have to have a buffer on the uplands right next to a CRD project? And so, just like Jill and Doug have said, they put together a stakeholder meeting, or a stakeholder committee. They had local governments, they had developers, they had the public, they had environmental groups, and they all worked to address this issue of what a buffer would look like. And again, this is a buffer that's designed to protect the marsh. And we've got more marsh probably than any other state on the East Coast. And the reason you have the buffer again is to protect the marsh. So this group was put, this stakeholder group was put together. The work was very messy. Everybody didn't get everything they wanted, but that stakeholder work served as the basis for these upland rules. And what CRD did after that stakeholder group completed its work was to get the DNR board to pass the rules. The rules said there had to be a 50-foot buffer. CRD applied them across the board to all projects. And so that is the question we're addressing right now. Should CRD stop putting the 50-foot buffer on bulkheads? And again, bulkheads are really, you really need to regulate bulkheads because they can cause such a problem with the marsh. In fact, typically what happens with bulkheads is the marsh will get eroded in front of the bulkhead and the marsh will actually disappear in front of the bulkhead. That's why we don't like bulkheads. And there's other alternatives to having bulkheads, like living shorelines. So anyway, the stakeholder group got together, came up with certain conclusions. The rules were put in place. CRD was regulating, all the projects, including bulkheads. And now CRD is trying to strip the 50-foot buffer for bulkhead projects with an upland component, so that buffer would no longer be there. And just as Courtney with the Georgia Conservancy said, there's been a lot of confusion about all of this, ever since 2007. Let's get another stakeholder group together to finish the story of exactly how buffers should be enforced, just like Dave was questioning, how EPD regulates bulkheads, how CRD regulates bulkheads, get the public, get local governments together and actually sit down and really think about this important issue. And the reason EPD needs to be at the table is because there is so much overlap and confusion considering EPD buffers and CRD buffers, and the two agencies, although they coordinate to some extent, we need to figure out exactly how we regulate these areas along the coast. Do I have another?
I've reset it for 1 minute.
For what?
For another minute, I've reset.
Okay, another minute. I'm just going to give you an example of how confusing this can be. Right now, if you're a developer, if you're an applicant, and you want to put in a bulkhead, you can put that bulkhead in the marsh, and you would have to go and visit with CRD to get authorization. But if you move your bulkhead inland, so it doesn't cross the jurisdictional line that CRD puts in place, you would only have to go to EPD. You wouldn't have to go to CRD. That's just, that's kind of crazy. I mean, that you move your bulkhead 1 foot and you talk to EPD, you move your bulkhead into the marsh, you don't necessarily have to talk to EPD, but you do have to get a permit from CRD. I mean, that's confusing to me, that's confusing to the public, and I'm sure it's confusing to the agencies. So the whole idea of a stakeholder group is to address questions like that. And we just want a stakeholder group to be assembled. We really want to work with CRD, with EPD, with the public, with developers and consultants to come up with a buffer along the coast that makes sense and protects the marsh. So that's it.
Thank you. Anyone else change their mind since, yes, go on.
I wasn't going to say anything, but I'm thoroughly confused at this point, and I think I might better. My name's Robert Cobb. I don't represent any major organization anymore. I'm retired. I'm a veterinarian, but I'm a homeowner, and I am the immediate past chairman of an architectural committee for a big development area. And these things are very much on our mind when we're trying to build homes, when we're living in our own home. And it's very confusing. But I also think the marsh should be protected, period. I feel like that if I'm understanding what I'm hearing correctly, and it's very likely I'm confused, if we do not enforce this buffer that you have been enforcing, this 50-foot buffer, which I'm assuming that means there's no construction within that 50 feet unless you approve it and it's a variance. Then what you're going to basically do, the way I see it, is you're going to move, the only thing that's going to protect anything except the list of about 4 or 5 things you mentioned is going to be the 25-foot EPD barrier, which in my mind says that 25 feet of the marsh is now going to become a buffer. In other words, if you don't have a buffer that covers this much, if you take that away, now it's going to be over here. And so that concerns me, is that if people are able to move into that buffer area and construct within that buffer area, then the marsh will not be protected. And so if I'm all wet and misunderstanding things, I'd appreciate you helping me to understand, but that's my comment. Thank you.
Alice?
Thank you.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. My name is Alice Miller-Keyes, and I'm the Vice President of Coastal Conservation with 100 Miles. I have lived in coastal Georgia for 15 years or so, and prior to working with 100 Miles, I worked for the Environmental Protection Division, so I fully understand the complexity of the issue that we're dealing with here, and I appreciate the opportunity to offer some comments. But I'm going to follow Mr. Cobb's statements about the importance of the buffer. Coastal Georgia's marshlands are our signature landscape, and they're nature's sponges. They absorb floodwater and dampen storm surge and filter pollutants. And the area behind the buffer, or upland of our marshes, is as important as the marshlands themselves. These transition zones are known as the buffers. And Bill talked about it earlier, Courtney did as well. And they're critical to reducing the damage to the marsh function and to protecting the buildings and the developments within the uplands. Georgia's dynamic coastal environment is critical, and the more natural that buffer area, the better. Living shorelines that were mentioned earlier are a great example of a method of shoring up property and enhancing the function of the marsh. Bulkheads, though, are a shoreline stabilization mechanism that function extremely differently by design. They're a method to harden or armor the natural transition area, and by definition are designed to separate land and sea, eliminating the function of that natural area. CRD even, and I'm going to quote a document that they have out, says that broad scientific consensus is that armoring degrades the integrity of the marine environment. The change that's being proposed today, we appreciate the updates that were made between the first version and the second version, but I'm here to request that more changes be made, in particular related to shoreline stabilization projects. If anything, CRD should retain the responsibility to manage and regulate activities within the 25-foot buffer behind our marshes because of the critical functionality of that buffer. There have been mentioned the role that EPD plays, and again, my role at the Environmental Protection Division helps me understand this specifically. Ms. Andrews responded to my question about the revocable license, regarding an agreement between EPD and CRD. I believe that agreement was issued in September of 2001. Thank you for sending me a copy of that. But it talks about the overlap, and in that overlap of the projects that are permitted with a CMPA permit, EPD's sole responsibility is to issue a variance for any erosion and sedimentation control activities within that 25-foot buffer. So basically, if they get a CRD permit, there's no erosion sedimentation control responsibility. Additionally, another complicating factor is that even the erosion sedimentation control manual that EPD follows is developed by the Georgia Soil and Water Conservation Commission. It's related to best management practices for reducing the erosion and sedimentation that goes into the waters of our state. There are no conditions appropriate for coastal environment, and they're certainly not appropriate for marsh impacts. That relates to both EPD's responsibility and the local issuing authority. So if we're expecting protection of our marsh buffer to be done by Environmental Protection Division and the local issuing authority, we have to be able to update them, change their requirements, change their regulations so that our marshlands are protected. And the last complicating factor is that you mentioned earlier the joint permitting responsibility with the Corps of Engineers that no longer seems to apply. There's a lot of confusion about who do you go to for activities within that, not only within the marsh itself based on size, but also within the buffer. So I will also reiterate another request for a stakeholder committee, because that extensive engagement is the only way that we're going to have assurance that our marshes are protected for the long haul, for this generation and for the next, including those property owners who will be impacted by activities that happen next door to them and even further downstream. So again, please consider making additional amendments and adding in shoreline stabilization projects to your draft rule, and then also consider convening a stakeholder engagement group that involves all the regulatory agencies and interested parties involved in this. Again, thank you for the opportunity to be here. We appreciate y'all.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak. My name is Josiah Watts. I'm a colleague of Alice at 100 Miles. I'm also from Sapelo Island, a Sapelo descendant, and St. Simons. So I grew up on the coast all my life. I wanted to come to this meeting. I really found out about it through my work with 100 Miles, because I care about the coast. I care about what is happening. As I'm sitting here and I'm listening to everything, I came from a time where I grew up on what is now on Mallory Street, but it was called Proctor Lane, and I lived down the street from, Miss Bessie Jones. I remember when I could, walk down to the beach and actually see the beach and not see all these developments and buildings. And and I think about the loss of culture and history. When we're talking about bulkheads, we're also talking about development. That means that there's construction and building, near these spaces on the coast and the marsh. These are spaces that have incredible value to us, to our lives, to our ecological system, to our growth, nature, resiliency, all those things come to mind for me. And when I was growing up, we would never think about building anything near the marsh. It wouldn't make sense. And so, but I look at what's happening now, and I hope that this amendment can be reconsidered. I hope that the requests that Alice and everyone else has said can be thought about. I hope that we take a step back and think about, when you said stakeholder committees, I was thinking to myself, well, who are the people that are on these committees? Are there people that are on these committees that are people that are, what I like to say, original descendants in communities? People like me that are direct descendants of people, that are from places like Sapelo, or from what St. Simons used to look like when we're talking about this. And I always remember my father worked for the water sewer department. He would say to me, he said, they're gonna develop this place way too fast, son. And the history and the culture are gonna be at risk and they'll go with it. You know, and I just came back home like a year or so ago, and I think back now of this place and I couldn't imagine not being here now. And it is worth fighting for. I think it is so important that, I don't know what reason, you know, CRD may have for saying, hey, we wanna kind of back away from this, but I think it is so important that we have all of these agencies in these spaces, because we've gotta find ways to help people protect themselves from themselves. You know, as they continue to make these decisions that are, in the long term, very detrimental to these spaces. And that's not even getting into, you know, the history and the culture that's at risk when I'm thinking about all of this. So I would just hope, you know, that these comments are strongly taken into consideration of what everyone has said. And we think about the impact that we're having when these activities or development and all these things, you know, are being allowed. Because again, when I hear bulkhead, I'm thinking, oh, well, that means somebody is building near spaces where they probably shouldn't be building near. And then all of a sudden we got flooding and all these other issues and problems. And the reason that they're flooding is because of where they have built the spaces that they're in. And so maybe just taking some time and thinking about this a little bit more, but even more important, you know, really engaging, you know, people that even have what I call indigenous knowledge in these spaces, that grew up in these spaces and they understood and still understand how the water flows, how the marshes breathe, and the importance of us protecting them. You know, the coast is an amazing and beautiful place, and we should treasure it. And I think that some places should be sacred. Some places don't need to be built on or built over. And maybe those are the things that we should all be thinking about when we're looking at this. So I just really hope that CRD does take all of these things into consideration. Thank you.
Anyone else? All right, well, I appreciate, again, your attendance tonight. I sense that there's still some questions out there, and we'll do our best to clear those for you over the next few days. If you send us questions in, we'll try to reply to those. But again, the public comment period ends the 19th, and we will work with those comments to get responses back out to those and supply those to the Board of Natural Resources as well as part of our package. All right? Thank you for coming. Thank you.
I'm going to leave one of their thought with you.
Second.